A continuación, para no tomar más tiempo, me permito presentar a ustedes al profesor Timothy Chappell con la ponencia Science, Non-Science and Nonsense. El profesor Timothy Chappell estudió Classics and Philosophy en el Magdalen College de Oxford y escribió su doctorado, una comparación de Aristóteles y puntos de vista de San Agustín sobre el libre albedrío, en la Facultad de Teología de la Universidad de Edimburgo. Entre 1992 y 1995 fue investigador junior en el Wolfson's College y profesor en el Merton College, en Oxford. También ha sido profesor de la Asociación de Trabajadores de la Educación y en la Universidad de East Anglia, Manchester y Dundee. Entre las obras que ha presentado, entre muchos otros, se encuentran The Inescapable Self, Western Philosophy Since Descartes, Values and Virtues, Collected Essays, Ethics and Experience, Life Beyond the Moral Theory, The Moral Problem of the Manliness, Collected Essays. Se les está entregando un handout con las principales citas que el profesor usará a lo largo de su exposición, además que proyectará la misma, pero en inglés. Les ruego que guardemos nuestras preguntas al final y que sean breves, dado que el profesor tiene mucho que ofrecernos el día de hoy, por lo que si las preguntas son concretas, será excelente. Recibámoslo con un fuerte aplauso.
Soy feliz, mucho feliz de estar aquí. Mil gracias a nosotros organizadores por este congreso novedador y magnífico. No soy mucho feliz que hoy no hablé español. Pero por mí es demasiado difícil. Y por vosotros, mucho más difícil. Hablé inglés. Perdonadme. These are my daughters, by the way, standing on a breakwater in Scotland. Always in my thoughts. I want to talk today about a project in epistemology. And I hope everyone can see the handout, because I have, as usual, too much material. And I will be, as usual, moving through it too fast. I am presenting a research project here, a research program. And it's a big research program. That, of course, is part of the fun. I want to ask the question whether there's knowledge that isn't scientific knowledge. And I hope you can see already how that question in epistemology is an important one for our theme in this wonderful conference, for our theme of science and religion. In much of what I say, I'm going to be using the work, or starting from the work, or disagreeing with the work of the English philosopher Timothy Williamson. Timothy Williamson wrote a wonderful book called Knowledge and Its Limits. And the principle of that book is that if you want to understand epistemology, you need to start not with belief or justified true belief or certainty. You need to start with knowledge first. And that's why my questions here are about knowledge. Here's my answer. There is non-scientific knowledge. People of a certain fairly extreme persuasion tend to think that if it's not science, then it's nonsense. I reject that view. People of a less extreme persuasion, though they don't think that non-science is nonsense, they have a lot of trouble explaining how it's not nonsense. Well, I think it's an interesting problem, what non-scientific knowledge could be, and I'm exploring it. I'm not claiming that I have all the answers, of course. I'm not claiming that I find what I'll call humane knowledge unproblematic. Of course there are problems. But the pleasure and the interest is to explore them. If there's only one variety of knowledge, then there's just one way for things to be knowledge. But if there's more than one variety, there might be lots of ways in which things could be knowledge. So here are some candidates. The first is propositional knowledge. I know that Mexico City is big. Sé que la ciudad es grande. This seems to be the variety of knowledge into which typical scientific knowledge fits. Or so you might think. Actually, I think there's a question there. We'll come back to it. Knowledge that is propositional knowledge. That's my first variety. Then, experiential knowledge, as I call it. There's a famous thought experiment by Frank Jackson, the Australian philosopher, about Mary the colour scientist. The key claim about Mary is this: she knows all the facts of physics. She works on the science of colour, yet she's never experienced red. Jackson's question: suppose she lives all her life. Philosophy is full of crazy thought experiments. Suppose she lives all her life in a black and white room, never sees anything except black, white, and grey. Presumably she's covered in paint herself. I don't know how it works. She steps out of her monochrome room into our world of colour. Jackson's question: does she learn something? Jackson's answer: yes, she does. Now, what Jackson doesn't say is that this is not propositional knowledge, and that's what I want to say. What she learns is experiential knowledge. She learns what it's like to see red. You can experience lots of things, of course. Lots of qualities are there to be experienced. The bigness of Mexico City, the greenness of a leaf, and so on. That's my second variety of knowledge. Experiential knowledge. My third variety, knowledge how. I know how to speak Spanish, if only. I know how to make $1 million overnight, if only. We have knowledge how when we know how to do things, when we have abilities and we act on them. That's the idea of knowledge how. So those three are the ones I call the probable candidates. And all of them are, I think, pretty clearly distinct things. There's a famous body of work on knowledge how by the English philosopher Gilbert Ryle. There's a famous body of work on experiential knowledge by the English philosopher, how culturally narrow am I, Bertrand Russell. These are themes that philosophers have explored. We know, I think we know, that there's more than just propositional knowledge. The two other probable candidates look like they're different varieties. Then here are two more problematic cases, which I call possible candidates. Possible candidates for the status of being genuinely varieties of knowledge. One is self-knowledge. The way you know yourself is quite different from the way you know any other person. And there are lots of phenomena, I can't go into them, I haven't time, but there are lots of phenomena which point to this distinctiveness. Suppose you're in this hall and you're standing up at the front and you're milling around and you look up at this screen as you're milling around and you say to yourself, some idiot is getting in the way of the camera. And then you take another look at where you're standing and you think, oh, it's me. The second claim is distinctively a first personal claim, a fairly basic and silly example. But there you are. There's something distinctive about self-knowledge, as first personal knowledge. Second personal knowledge. There seems to be something distinctive about the way you're aware of other people, too. Part of what I have to say about second personal knowledge, since I simply agree with Andrew Pinsent about it, I'm going to leave to him to say this afternoon. But let me give you a couple of pointers to the kind of thing I'm talking about when I talk about second personal knowledge. Sartre, the French philosopher, hooray, someone who's not English. The French philosopher Sartre has the famous example of shame. You think you're unobserved, you think nobody sees you. You're picking your nose or something. You're doing something vaguely crude and disgusting. And then you notice that someone's watching you, and you feel shame. Your whole sense of your environment changes when you see that there's another person in it. It's not just a bunch of chairs and desks. There's somebody watching you. Second personal knowledge is getting a sense of that kind of perspective that others have on us and that we have on them. Another phenomenon is joint attention. Andrew's going to talk about this. I won't talk about it much. But the phenomenon is that a lot of learning happens when the baby or the infant learns to focus on the playing cubes or the jigsaw, whatever it is, with someone else. The fact that there's someone else there makes all the difference to the structure of these occasions. And a third example, which isn't on the handout, but I can't resist giving it. When my daughter was born, her mother was being sorted out by the doctors. I was given my daughter to hold. This was my first daughter, when she'd just been born. And she lay in my arms, and she looked at me. And it's the most intense gaze I've ever been subjected to. Don't let any philosopher ever tell you that newborn babies are not proper persons. Okay, so those are the two possible candidates, alongside the three probable candidates for the status of being varieties of knowledge. There's a lot flying around here, isn't there? But bear with me. It doesn't look like those two possible candidates are on the same footing as the probable candidates. It looks like they're a different kind of kinds. I just note that. I'm not going to worry about it now. What I am going to do, because I think it's a lovely piece of writing, is give you a quick quotation from Gerard Manley Hopkins, the English poet and Jesuit. He writes this: "When we consider the mind, when I consider my self-being, my consciousness and feeling of myself, that taste of myself, of I and me, above and in all things, this is more distinctive than the taste of ale, beer, or alum, which is, I think, is a kind of mineral, more distinctive than the smell of walnut leaf or camphor. It's incommunicable by any means to another man. Nothing else in nature comes near this unspeakable stress of pitch, distinctiveness, and selving." I bet the interpreters are having a fit at all this. I'm sorry. "This self-being of my own, nothing explains it or resembles it, except that other men to themselves have the same feeling. Searching nature, I taste self, but at one tankard, one glass, that of my own being." That's a wonderful poetic description of our sense of ourself. There are lots of phenomena there. Noticing that it's you who's being caught on camera is one phenomenon. Sensing yourself in the way that Hopkins describes there, that's another phenomenon. I'm grouping them under self-knowledge. That may be a rough grouping, but you have to start somewhere. Now, for reasons of time, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but what we should notice about philosophy as it's usually practiced today is that it's an enterprise in reduction a lot of the time. We want things to be neat. We want things to be streamlined. We want to make it that there's just one kind of knowledge. So philosophers have tried, who have this mindset, to reduce all three of our probable candidates, propositional knowledge, experiential knowledge, knowledge how, to each other. And obviously the ultimate aim is to get it all down to one, which you can do by reducing that to that and reducing that to that. You can also do it by reducing that first to that and then to that, or by reducing that to that and then to that, and so on. There's lots of possible reductive projects. But none of them work. Some people think that propositional knowledge is based always on experience, and it's composed out of experience. And on the handout, I give a list of philosophers who take that view. I just don't think that's plausible. I don't think any number of perceptions can add up to a conception. Look at that, I'm 10 minutes behind. Behaviorists think that you can compress all knowledge down to knowledge how. It's just knowledge of how to behave in the world. It's just technique. I think that is a silly view, but I'm just positioning it on this map. Some philosophers, because experience is difficult if you're a physicalist, it's difficult to make sense of why we have experience in a physicalist framework. Some philosophers want to reduce experiential knowledge to propositional knowledge, and that's what Armstrong does in this quotation. And you can read the handout if you want to see why I think that's wrong. I'm trying to catch up with myself because I'm a bit behind on the time. The best reductive project I know stars Jason Stanley, an American philosopher, and Timothy Williamson, again. And it's in Journal of Philosophy 2001. And they say that knowing how to do something, is just two things. First, knowing of some W, some way of acting, that W is a way to phi. And second, knowing this, knowing what you know in A, under a practical mode of presentation. And the idea of a practical mode of presentation is that you know things in a particular way if you're trying to do them. And that doesn't seem to me to work. Again, I'm going to move fast through this because time is short. For some cases of knowledge how, it seems to me that Stanley and Williamson's conditions are both irrelevant. You know how to swim. This is true in English. I don't know if it's true in Spanish. But you know how to swim in English if and only if you can swim. So suppose you read Stanley and Williamson. They think knowledge how is something different from ability. In a case like this, it's clearly not. It's the very same thing. So suppose you go on an adrenaline adventure trip. You're in your wetsuit. You're standing on the brink of the rushing torrent. The instructor's standing next to you. The instructor puts his hand in the small of your back and says, "Do you know how to swim?" And you say, in line with what you've read in Stanley and Williamson, "Oh yes." So he pushes you in. And as you drown, you shout out, "Hey, I only said I knew how to swim. I didn't say I could swim." That seems to me as a completely unreasonable protest. In these cases, Stanley and Williamson's conditions just don't apply. In other cases, it looks like the first condition applies and the second condition doesn't. The second condition just doesn't add anything. You're in a lift. You know how to stop the lift if you know to press the button marked stop. Or if you're in a Spanish lift, then the button will say, I can't see what it will say. What's the Spanish for stop? Right, it will say that. That's all you need to know how to stop the lift. It doesn't matter whether you know that under a practical mode of presentation. If you know that, then you know how to stop the lift, even in Spanish. In other cases, the two conditions together don't get you to knowing how either. I know how to beat Korchnoi at chess only if I know, if I can do it fairly reliably, and if I know how in a sense which is much richer than Williamson's and Stanley's conditions seem to capture. Compare someone who actually beats Korchnoi at chess, like Karpov, and a chess commentator who's just watched the game. Now, the chess commentator understood how it happened. He followed the game. If you tell him, how did Karpov beat Korchnoi in this game, he will be able to tell you. But if you ask the chess commentator, do you know how to beat Korchnoi at chess? I submit his honest reply is, no, I don't. Why is that his honest reply? Because knowledge how has these three features, which are not features of the chess commentator's understanding, they are features of the understanding of Karpov. It's uncodifiable. It has a constitutive link with exemplars, and it has a constitutive link with success. I'm going to leave that for you to think about and move on. My claim so far, I haven't done nearly enough to justify it because I haven't time, but my claim so far is that the reductive projects fail. That shows that experiential knowledge and knowledge how are genuinely varieties. They're genuinely not the same thing as propositional knowledge. Are they genuinely knowledge, though? I think the answer to that is yes. Because what knowledge is, in general, is any aptitude-based and non-accidental cognitive success. It's aptitude-based inasmuch as you have the beliefs you do because you have some epistemic ability which you're exercising. It's non-accidental because it's not a belief that's just been planted into your head. It's success because things work out, and it's cognitive because it places you in what Wilfrid Sellers, in a famous essay, calls the space of reasons. That's what knowledge does. It enables you to do some reasoning. It enables you to act in the world in a rational way. It enables you to reflect. It does lots of things, of course. Now, another way of seeing how experiential knowledge and knowledge how are indeed varieties of knowledge, though not reducible to propositional knowledge, is to think about a sixth category of knowledge that isn't usually considered at all in modern philosophy. So much the worse for modern philosophy. And that's objectual knowledge. Here's some Greek. In Greek, the primary object of knowledge is objects. I'm talking about classical Greek, what Aristotle and Plato spoke. Understanding that Socrates is snub-nosed, his nose is like that, is understanding something about an object. It's the object that you understand first. The object is the main object of your understanding. Propositions spin off from that. You can say, I know that Socrates is snub-nosed. Ability knowledge spins off from that. You know how to treat Socrates. You know not to say rude things about his snub-nosedness. Experiential knowledge spins off from that. In meeting Socrates, you see what someone looks like when they have a snub nose. These are all spin-offs of objectual knowledge in something like the same way that the other categories in Aristotle's list are spin-offs of the category of substance. I was quite surprised to find myself making that connection. I didn't expect this to be an Aristotelian theory, but it turns out there is a link with Aristotle's thought here. I'm way behind. I'm still 10 minutes behind. Well, I'm not getting any worse. When you have objectual knowledge of something, that leads you naturally to exploration of what's true about it, and so to propositional knowledge about it, to sensory encounter with the thing, if that's possible, and so to experiential knowledge, to practical handling and exploration of it, and so to knowledge how. But objectual knowledge is the basic form. And maybe that sheds light on the two possible candidates, self-knowledge and second-person knowledge as well. I talked about them before, and I said we want to come back to them to try and get a better grip on what kinds of knowledge they are. Maybe objectual knowledge helps us to see that a bit. That's just a hunch. But now we've got this far, there's another thought that I started with that we might want to revise. I started by saying that scientific knowledge is primarily propositional knowledge. I'm not sure that's right. Perhaps science is really more about objectual knowledge. What we do is we attend to things. We attend to the objects of study, a species, a mathematical structure, a rock type, a molecule, a galaxy. We devote ourselves to them. We study them. We spend our lives, perhaps, studying them. I know someone who works at the University in Wales who spends his life studying how long clams live. That's the kind of project, the kind of detail that scientists engage in. Aristotle was interested in shellfish too. Science has an important humane value, precisely because science involves intellectual raptness, that kind of disciplined attentiveness to things that Simone Weil, the French philosopher, often talks about. So to sum up what we've got so far, I'm not saying that scientific knowledge is always propositional knowledge. That follows from what I've just said about objectual knowledge. I'm not saying that non-scientific knowledge, humane knowledge, is never propositional knowledge. Of course it is sometimes. What I am saying is that there's a lot of humane knowledge which is important and which is not propositional. And I'm going to go on to talk about that in the last part of my talk. Ethical knowledge how? That's perhaps the easiest case, because there's a tradition going back to Aristotle, which effectively treats the virtues as instances of knowledge how. When you have a virtue, you know how to see a situation. You know how to treat people. Courtesy is a virtue. You know how to treat people courteously. Courage is a virtue. When you have the virtue of courage, you know how to behave when you're involved in some dangerous fracas or a war or whatever, or when you just need the courage to stand up in front of people and talk about philosophy. These are places where courage is called for. Courage is knowing how to act in those situations. And notice, I said knowledge how in general had three particular features, which are those three there, A, B, and C. It's always being said about the virtues by virtue theorists. They're always saying that the virtues are uncodifiable. If they're knowledge how, that's exactly what you'd expect. Learning how to ride a bike is not something you can do just by looking it up in an instruction manual, because the instruction manual basically is full of propositional knowledge. It can get you some way, it can help a bit, but you need more than that. And the more that you need is uncodifiable. It's knowledge how. The virtues are constitutively linked with exemplars. By that I mean that if you want to understand what a virtue requires, the best place to look is to people who already have the virtue. They can teach you what it's like to have that virtue. The constitutive link with success. When you know how to do something, that isn't the same thing as being able to do it, as I noticed before. Nonetheless, there is a link. People who have the virtue of courtesy don't typically cause great offense to other people, don't typically come across as rude, because being courteous means succeeding in showing consideration for other people by politeness and smiling and saying hello, shaking hands, not turning your back on them in the middle of conversation, that kind of thing. And if you are courteous, you'll succeed in these ways. Experiential knowledge in ethics and aesthetics. I'm going to talk about this very quickly and then move on to the last thing I want to say. Here's an example of experiential knowledge and how it matters, both in aesthetics and in ethics. In Victor Hugo's wonderful novel Les Miserables, Marius Pontmercy arrives too late at his father's deathbed because his grandfather can't be bothered to get him there in time. Marius shares his grandfather's attitudes to his father's. They're at opposite ends of the political spectrum. They hate each other because of their political disagreement. Marius thinks his father has been neglecting him for his whole life. But shortly after his father's death, he discovers that his father loved him all along, had been missing him for the whole of his life, wishing he could see him. He also discovers that his father was a military hero at Waterloo. These discoveries turn Marius's world upside down. He comes to rethink his whole life. Now, we know how to respond to a narrative like that. We all read books. We watch soap operas on the television. We respond to the experiences that people have in those forms of art because we share a life with them. We know, here's the key phrase, we know what it's like to be in something like Marius's position. How do we know that? By imagining what it would be like to be in that position. What do we imagine on the basis of? Our own experience of life. Experiential knowledge is key in ethics because unless you understand what it's like to be in certain situations, you don't grasp everything that there is to grasp ethically about what's important about those situations. There's a rather emetic industry in ethics in Britain and America these days, in the Anglophone world in general. And the industry consists in asking the question, what's wrong with murder? And looking for an answer, where the answer is a definition, a proposition. Now, I find this industry fairly distasteful, not because I don't think that it couldn't reveal anything at all. Of course it can reveal something. But because there is a whole side, a whole dimension to the wrongness of murder that simply isn't captured in propositional terms. The way to capture it is to think about what it's like to see a murder, to be the victim of a murder, to perform a murder. We need that kind of imaginative grasp of the key points in our ethical lives if we're going to do ethics adequately. And unless the knowledge that we get in that experiential way corrects the knowledge that we have propositionally, things are going to go very wrong. We're going to end up with an ethics which may work nicely as a set of definitions and propositions, but bears no real relation to human experience. And I'm afraid to say that I think that's already happened. One other thing, second personal knowledge in ethics. Kant famously says in the groundwork, this is the second formulation of the categorical imperative, act always so that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, never merely as a means, but always at the same time as an end. I think there's a link between what Kant says and what I want to say. I think what Kant means there is that recognizing other people as persons, second personal knowledge of other people, is crucial to our ethical understanding. And a set of propositions about how to treat other people might capture a lot, might be interesting, might do lots of work. But unless you are aware of other people as persons in their own right, in a distinctively second personal way, then there's going to be a lot that you are going to miss. And of course, the question you always get asked at this point is the question, what are you going to miss? Tell me what you're going to miss. And very often that's a demand to state in propositional form what cannot be stated in propositional form because it's not propositional knowledge. It is nonetheless knowledge. And last of all, I'm a little behind still, but not as behind as I might be. I make it I'm now 5 minutes behind. Last of all, I want to talk about the case of religion, religious knowledge, and whether there's a place for the kind of varieties of knowledge that I've been talking about in religion. And I don't want to develop all the suggestions that you've got on your handout, but let me say a little about some of them. Knowledge how in religion, I think, might be exemplified in a response that we might develop to a familiar criticism of Pascal. After setting up his famous wager, Pascal says, "So I've shown by my wager that people are rational to believe in God. Next question, how do you make yourself believe in God?" And Pascal gets routinely flogged, berated in discussions of philosophy of religion for saying that the way to do it is to engage in religious practices, and once you've done that, then the propositional belief will follow on afterwards. Well, I think Pascal is guilty as charged if you read his text, Au pied de la lettre. However, I also think that there is a possible constructive amendment of what Pascal says, which points out that a lot of the knowledge that we have in the religious life might well be knowledge how, and that knowledge how to behave might well bring in its train propositional knowledge. If these are all varieties of knowledge, then why shouldn't what you learn from one buttress what you learn from another? Why shouldn't they be mutually supporting? Why shouldn't learning knowledge how be a way of attaining propositional knowledge? But what I want to talk about in more, well, I don't know how much detail I'll give you, but what I want to talk about next is experiential knowledge in religion and second personal knowledge in religion. And again, there's more than I will say here on the handout. Here's a quotation from a classic book by Rudolf Otto called The Idea of the Holy. Is this a book that's known in the Spanish world? Rudolf Otto, The Idea of the Holy? It's a wonderful book. It really is. It's right up there with William James' book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, as an exploration of the theme of religious experience. Here's what Otto says: if there's any domain of human experience that presents us with something unmistakably specific and unique, peculiar to itself, assuredly it's the religious life. And Otto goes on in that book, which I recommend you to read, to distinguish three kinds of experience. And one of these, well, actually all of these experiences, forms of experience, have something very distinctive about them. What tends to happen again and again is that religious experience, experience of a sense of mystery, of awe, of wonder, of something like that, it spills over into a sense that there's a person there, that there's a personal presence. One of the oldest and most beautiful expressions of this thought is put on the mouth of, is it Jacob or Abraham? I always get this mixed up. It's in the book of Genesis, and I'm going to find it for you now and read it, if I can find it. In the book of Genesis, it says, I think it's Jacob at Bethel, "What a wonderful place this is. Truly God was in this place, and I knew it not. This is the gate of heaven." What happens there is that someone, in encountering something awful, mysterious, tremendous, senses God behind it, comes to think that there's a person there. There's a spillover from religious experience in the sense of awe into religious experience in the sense of a person. And this is in Augustine too. He says at the bottom of that page that I have on the handout there, "Tu autem eras interior intimio meo, et superior summo meo." But you were more close to me than the closest part of myself is close to me. And you were more superior to me than the highest part of myself. From a sense of awe, a sense of wonder, grows a sense that there's a person there that you're dealing with. From that sense, there grows also a revision of your understanding of yourself. And so self-knowledge comes along with the second personal knowledge that seems to happen in religion. So I'm doing here little more than surveying possibilities for knowledge. I'm simply noting that in the case of ethics and in the case of religion, there's a great deal at the experiential level and at the second personal level which people find vividly real and which they are surer of than they might be of any counter-argument. And what I want to close, there's a quotation which Antonio Lezcano had up on the projector yesterday. "Man is the being who is supposed to say thou to God in eternity." I think that's a wonderful quotation. I wasn't quick enough to write down the reference. But this is the idea that I'm trying to get at, that religious experience can and often does include the sense of a relationship, the sense of another person there to whom you are related. And that can be so vivid that even when you think at the level of propositional knowledge, there are doubts about God's existence. This kind of knowledge, experiential knowledge, can provide a counterweight in your epistemic states, in your understanding. You can get the sense that there's a person there, even if you can't explain how. And that's the thought that I want to close with. It's true that there can't be any genuine religious experiential knowledge. There can't be any genuine religious second personal knowledge unless there really is a God to experience, unless there really is a person there to be in relationship with. Sure, that point from the propositional knowledge side is entirely fair, but it's only half the story. The other half of the story is that just as propositional knowledge, what we find there, can be put in the scales against what we find in in our experience, so it can work the other way. If your experience, your experiential knowledge of God is vivid enough, then it can provide a counterweight to doubts at the propositional level. It's simply not the case that propositional knowledge is always trumps. It's simply not the case that propositional knowledge is always the final court of appeal for all other claims to knowledge. Our understanding is more complex and more varied than that. I think that in most areas of inquiry, including science, including religion, we can't get true understanding unless we're prepared to use, to deploy, all our sources of knowledge, all the varieties of knowledge that I've been talking about. Chairman Mao famously said, "Let 100 flowers bloom." There's not much I agree with Chairman Mao about, but I do agree with him about this, that too much of philosophy today, too much academic thought in general, is about reducing, restricting, streamlining, identifying, getting things down to a simple story. I think our story about knowledge is much too simple to do justice to the facts. I want to explore the possibility that non-propositional knowledge of the various kinds I've been talking about might have real and important things to say, both to the scientist and also to the theologian. Thank you very much.
I'm enormously grateful to Timothy Chappell for taking the time to come to this conference and for his wonderful contribution this morning. I think he's really underlined how important it is to have a very good philosophical basis in order to do good work in science and religion. Also, by some miracle, he managed to finish exactly 45 minutes after he started, which does leave us a few minutes for questions. Would you like to take some questions?
I'm very happy to. Well, okay. Would it be all right if I stood at the podium?
Yes.
Because then I can see my questions. I'm blinded by the light if I sit there, so I'll stand here.
Thank you. It was a lovely conference, and my name is I'm from Argentina, and I would like to ask you whether this second-person knowledge, how it relates to what in neuroscience is called the mechanisms of theory of mind.
My answer is, I wish I knew more about the neuroscience involved. But from the little I do understand, I know that people are uncovering through neuroscience what seem to be mechanisms in the brain which are specifically dedicated to our awareness of other people. So it begins to look as if there might be a neurophysiological basis for one of the distinctions I want to make. And if so, then hooray.
Thank you.
Yes. Gentleman here. Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Chappell, for your lecture, very clear and clarifying. My question is the following. What is your position, your opinion about phenomenology? Because phenomenology, coming from Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, and Sartre, tries to take into account of experiences. But the problem for Husserl was that first, there is a great difference between scientific knowledge with exact concepts and experience and knowledge with morphological concepts. It's quite different. And the second problem is what we can do with this experiential knowledge for obtaining universality. What is the methodological approach for obtaining some universality? That is my first question. The second one, what is your personal approach to experiential knowledge of embodiment, life core, life body, especially the experiences concerning death and other things. Thank you very much.
What a very rich question. Let me say 3 things in response. First of all, I think Husserl is a great philosopher, and I've started reading him recently, and I wish I'd started reading him before. The phenomenological tradition in Germany and France and Italy and other places too has often been ignored in analytical philosophy, which is the kind I basically do, very much to the detriment of both. It's been a very bad, it's a cultural disaster that people don't talk to each other. And sometimes their inability to speak other languages is part of the problem. There's a lot to learn from writers like Husserl and Sartre. And one person who I think is on the handout, but I haven't said his name yet, Martin Buber. He writes phenomenologically. He's very interested in the contents of experience. He's someone from whom there is a lot to learn, especially on the subject of religion. Now, scientific knowledge and non-scientific knowledge. You were saying that scientific knowledge is often precise and non-scientific knowledge is often vague. And of course that's true. But one thing that I want to capture under the heading of experiential knowledge is what you might call direct perception, recognition. For example, if you speak Spanish and you look at the words Buenas tardes on a piece of paper, you won't notice, very likely you won't notice what type font they're in, you won't notice what color the paper is, you'll just pick up the words. You don't need to do any inferring. You don't need to do any logic to get to the conclusion. That says Buenas tardes. You just see it. When my wife walks through the door, I don't need to say, brown hair, brown eyes, glasses, it's my wife. I just see it's my wife. Now that kind of direct perception, I don't know whether to classify it as vague or precise, but what I'm fairly sure of is that it occurs both in science and in ordinary life. I've just given ordinary life examples of direct perception. Here's one from Gilbert Harman, which is scientific. There goes a proton. You're looking at a cloud chamber, whatever a cloud chamber may be, and you spot a proton, whatever a proton may be, zipping across this cloud chamber. And being a trained physicist, you know how to see this. You see, there goes a proton, direct perception. So I don't think that direct perception is necessarily vague, and I think it often crops up in science too. On knowledge of our body, I think the ways in which that relates to our knowledge of ourselves is, and indeed to our knowledge of other people, is immensely interesting. And if I were to address it properly, then my answer, which is already too long, would go on much longer. But there's a lot to say there.
I think it's gentleman on the left here.
Thank you very much. So I found your paper quite appealing. And well, I have
Let's start.
Basically 2 questions. First, I was wondering if you have checked Davidson's work on the interlocking account or first-person knowledge, second-person knowledge, and third-person knowledge. And if you have, how does it fit broadly into your perspective? That's one of the questions. And another is if you have, or if somebody has told you about the work by the Mexican philosopher Luis Villoro, Creer, Saber, Conocer, where he makes certain distinctions about these kinds of knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd need to know more precisely which bits of Davidson and the Mexican philosopher in question you're directing me towards. We'd have to talk about that in more detail, I think, for me to answer this question really productively. But very briefly, on Davidson, whom I do know, he's working within a broadly Fregean, a post-Fregean framework, within which the key distinction is between the facts as they are and modes of presentation of those facts. And Davidson, like most other analytical philosophers, thinks that there is such a thing as the first personal mode of presentation. But what is characteristically denied from Frege onwards in that tradition is the idea that there's anything basically real about these perspectives. The thought seems to be, because they're perspectives, they can't be real. There's something illusory about them. People like Derek Parfit explicitly say that kind of thing. And I want to question that. This idea that if you take the view from nowhere on the facts, then you have hold of the only kind of reality there really is, the world as it is anyway, in a phrase of Bernard Williams. Whereas if you look at it from a perspective, then there's something illusory about the way you see it. I think we need to separate out the ideas of illusoriness and perspectivality, if that's a word. Sorry, interpreters. Because those two things are not the same at all. Things can be perfectly real and yet perspectival. And that's partly what I'm urging.
I think it's gentleman about halfway back at the... Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. My question has to do with something I consider is very important for the discussion or the dialogue between science and religion. And it has to do with whether you consider that there may be or there might be also different kinds of propositional knowledge, in the sense that, of course, the dimension of religious experience is fundamental for the understanding of every religious tradition, but there are also very important propositional dimension in every religious tradition, and there are different accounts of how things are and things like that. So whether there are different ways of producing and justifying propositions and that account as varieties of propositional knowledge.
What I don't want, I totally agree, thanks for the question. What I don't want to give the impression of me doing is I don't want you to go away with the impression that I'm saying non-propositional knowledge good, propositional knowledge bad. That's not it at all. I don't for a moment dispute the importance and the value of propositional knowledge. Of course not. Who could? I'm not going to I'm not going to paint myself into the corner where I have to say that all our ethical knowledge and all our religious knowledge is non-propositional. Not a bit of it. The point is simply that a lot of it is not propositional. And again, I come back there to this great, grave tendency in modern philosophy to take extreme positions. I read so many articles where someone starts by painting himself or herself right into a corner, and then he spends the rest of the article fighting his way out. And it's much better not to paint yourself into the corner in the first place.
I think it's Bill Cowell.
Thank you. Thank you, Timothy. Particularly instructive in locating...
Could you hold the microphone a bit closer?
Sorry, particularly instructive in locating concepts of scientific knowledge within broader categories of knowledge, showing us in a certain sense the analogical notion of knowledge, not only with respect to human knowledge, but even if we talk about angelic knowledge or animal knowledge, whatever.
Right.
But even for the dialogue between science and religion, there is a kind of another sort of impoverishment even within scientific knowledge. That when scientific knowledge, since really the 17th century and perhaps a little bit before, has limited the categories of what constitutes scientific knowledge to the empirical sciences, thus excluding philosophy and theology from the general category of propositional and objectional knowledge, leaving aside all the questions about experiential knowledge. But simply within the categories of scientific knowledge, there has been this impoverishment, this narrowing of the notion of scientific knowledge and its categories, which has had a significant effect on dialogue between science and religion, because philosophy and theology are simply excluded from categories of discourse, even within the notions of propositional and objectional knowledge.
I completely agree. And one of the things that I'm trying to do in this paper, one of the many sub-papers which are implicit in this rather wide-ranging paper, one of the sub-papers is a paper about the philosophy of science. And in that I would develop the thoughts about objectual knowledge that I very briefly sketched about halfway through my presentation. This idea that in science all you're seeking is propositional truth, that seems to me deeply mistaken. Scientists in practice devote their lives to studying things. And whether those things are mathematical objects or clams or other sea fish, shellfish, or the human being or the heart or cancer or whatever it is, they devote themselves to studying things. And of course what they're after is objectual knowledge. And of course that objectual knowledge implies propositional knowledge, and experiential knowledge too, and knowledge how too. But it is in itself of a basically different form. And this with propositional knowledge, it's almost like humanity is a child who's discovered that one thing works really well. And because that works really well, we've rejected all the other things. We've neglected all the other things we could be doing. It's true that propositional knowledge works really well. It produces some really neat intellectual results, no denying it. But we should look at other varieties of knowledge too, because maybe they have as much potential.
I know that a few people have got their hands up, but I think we've only got time for one more question. But I do encourage you to speak to Professor Chappell during the break. And I think the gentleman over here probably had his hand up first. So the gentleman from Austral University.
Hello, Alejandro Clause from the University of Austral in Buenos Aires. I like it very much, the concept of the uncodifiability of the knowledge. It's very related with the concept of not algorithmic knowledge in artificial intelligence that you use. How do you program that in a computer code? Now,
sorry, what kind of knowledge in artificial intelligence?
Non-algorithmic. In
Non-algorithmic,
intelligence,
right.
we call that type of thing non-algorithmic, because
Right.
you cannot reduce to a set of lines in the program.
Yes.
Now, my problem was with the definition of knowledge that you put. You use the word cognitive inside it, so it's a tautological in a way, because
Right.
Cognitive is from knowledge, and so I come from hard science, so in my hard science mind, it's stuck. I got stuck there. And the other question is, I like very much the metaphors and the knowledge through metaphors and the other kind of non-propositional model. But my problem is, what about delusions?
Mm-hmm.
What about if you put everything in the same bag? Putting myself in the position of the people that do not like non-propositional knowledge, they say, what about delusions?
Yeah.
It's a bunch of things. You cannot differentiate it between if you are deluded. You are seeing something that is subjective or problem with an illness or something like that.
Well, okay, on the first point about cognitive, I wanted a word in there that meant that I was talking about a specific enough kind of success, so that winning the World Series baseball wouldn't count as success, according to my definition. And I wanted a word which meant something like knowledge-related. And I agree with you that if you think the word cognitive means knowledge-related, then yes, there is a circularity in my definition. First point about that, when you find a circularity, you should always then ask, is it a vicious circularity or is it all right? Because not all circularities are a bad thing. Second point, I have a friend who goes, "Arr, arr." That's a vicious circle. Oh, never mind. The second point, maybe I should just gloss cognitive in that definition as understanding related. Because understanding is clearly a different thing from knowledge. And it might include knowledge, but it's a bigger thing than knowledge. Okay, and the other point about illusions. I suppose my ultimate aim in all this is to suggest that scientific knowledge is really part of humane knowledge. I have made it sound a lot of the time as if those two were two things which were opposed. But what I ultimately want to do is pursue the notion of objectual knowledge far enough to make credible the suggestion that actually humane knowledge is a larger whole of which scientific knowledge is a part. Then illusions are always going to be unmasked, if and when they are unmasked, and of course they're not always. They're going to be unmasked by getting more knowledge surrounding the illusion, by bringing different bits of knowledge up to it to test that illusion according to them. If you want to see whether something is real, the only thing you can do is bring to bear on that case what you know from other cases. So some people are perfectly convinced that they have experienced being abducted by aliens. What do we say about them? Am I committed to saying that they've got experiential knowledge? No, because experiential knowledge faces the tribunal of the other kinds of knowledge, just as the other kinds of knowledge face the tribunal, each of them faces the tribunal of all the other kinds of knowledge. So we constantly compare them with each other. And if you like, you can call that a coherentist method, although I myself find it rather difficult when push comes to shove to tell coherentism from correspondence theories of proof or truth. Thank you for your question.
Bueno, agradecemos al profesor con un fuerte aplauso. Muchas gracias. Muy bien, muchas gracias.